Betas for any kind of games are notoriously fickle beasts. They offer this onset of problematic thoughts on titles that are not yet finished or possibly generating hype for a game that's cornerstone isn't being tested, such as online connectivity and the reality of release date windows. And this can easily calcify gamers' thoughts as suspicions and impressions harden and are becoming resistant to being broken up by changes a game may have upon its actual release. New Worlds somehow broke through those, mostly because its changes were a solid, yet somehow still dynamic example of resources being practically unlimited and the possible realization internally that failure by shortcuts was going to be the end of Amazon Studios. Back 4 Blood is another beast entirely. A 4-person level-based shooter with a card system built in that, admittedly, doesn't necessarily make the greatest first impression. But after playing it for a good deal of time now, how does it actually come out of a review? Well, let's check it out. Subscribe to the channel if you like it. Let's jump into this. Back 4 Blood, the review. Mood, atmosphere, tone, those are all as important as graphical fidelity, despite what resolution pixel counting videos and ray tracing tech breakdowns are going to have you believe. Back 4 Blood faces a significantly unique situation here, as its card system can change the appearance of a level dramatically with just one card. I worked through a level about 11 times, nothing specifically catching my attention in the level. It looked good, but it didn't look necessarily unique. And Back 4 Blood levels don't help themselves because they're not architecturally challenging. They're not necessarily supposed to be. There's only 2 or 3 ways to get through most of the time, and they're funneling gamers and ghouls into the same breakneck fuck you death tunnel, and resting on the laurels of action mattering more than action set piece. Until I got the fog card. Enter pure friggin' madness. This is a pure example of why people get lost in the woods and die all the time. This fog sets in thicker than you've ever seen before, and a level you may have faced half a dozen times before turns into an Escher painting that's just been smashed down like he said, screw it, you paint it yourself. Moody, light bleeds in through trees that you didn't even notice in the past passings. And while the ridden themselves alternate between ho-hum design and excellence, the environments can change the way they feel. The major forces are zombie-like ridden, shambling towards you, nothing special. Homeowners, dog walkers, chum for the shark frenzy that's going to happen in seconds when the players chew through them with their guns moments later. But then you start getting special enemies and variants, stretched out throat singers with huge red streaky glands that seek out sound, and if they find you, they scream, alerting the horde. Not exactly new, but then you get a card called the Hag. The Hag is next level creepy. It's Rucklebone from Legend with a gut of Fat Thor and a hankering for heroes. It shambles into the fight and tries to bash one of the heroes senseless and then swallow them only to shit them out someplace in the level that you have to go, find them, and break them out from. We've seen main catcher style enemies before in other games like Vermintide and Vermintide 2. The Hag is just a nightmare fuel idea though, mixed with a typical enemy design that works regardless of the actual graphical changes to the levels that may occur. If you have fog and a Hag shows up, it can be a frightening moment. If you can clearly see the Hag running towards you, well, it's still a pretty frightening moment. However, I would like to have seen the actual weapon effects be a little bit better. Guns in themselves, not too bad, but the explosion effects and the bigger ones overall don't necessarily have that overarching feel that I would like. Firing is fine. The game is basically a mixture of pretty much those two things in a recipe that really just includes ridden vomit and your own firepower as its recipe ingredients. When you have an explosion go off near you and you fly across the level, it looks decidedly low rent, very beta already, all by itself. The animation doesn't really play out. There's no real ragdoll physics. In fact, you just sort of solidify into a piece of animation that freezes as you fly around. However, once you start going around, you start taking out enemies and they flop and they react to those shots. That part can actually look very good. Character design across the 12 heroes, though, is very tropish. Be aware of that. There's nothing really that you see that makes you go, oh, wow. You have the punker chick, and of course, you've got the guy who's the redneck. You have all of the characters that you would expect. Performance is also pretty much what you expect. On the PC, getting 4K with a 2080 Ti is going to be possible with a couple settings, while getting good FPS on the consoles, including the Xbox Series X, isn't that difficult. There were a couple fits and stutters on the Xbox X, but once I went in and I adjusted the FOV setting, which, by the way, the higher you go, of course, you'll lose FPS there, I got it actually locked in pretty well. With a 1080 Ti, you can easily get 1080p or 1440p with a couple adjustments here. There aren't a ton of adjustments that you can make on the PC version, but there's enough that it's going to allow you to go out there and grab some extra FPS if you want. On the console versions, I didn't see any other kind of graphical setting other than the FOV, so be aware of that. As a complete package, I think the game looks fairly good. There are some rough spots for sure, including any liquid moments, and there are some levels where there's a lot of water you're running past. Environmentally, fire looks great, but the vomit kind of thing, which is something of course we see in a lot of games, just doesn't really interact with the locations as much as I would like. Also, those environments, while worksman-like, I didn't have a problem with. However, there are a couple that you go around and you can very much see the gamified level kind of design that goes on in these. Your mileage is going to vary if that bothers you.
Surrounded here. Reloading. Razor wire here.
What is this shit?
Luckily, I don't think anything within the audio system is going to bother you. This has excellent environmental and directional sound. If you have good headphones or even a better surround sound system of some kind, I suggest you dive deep into this and set it up. The game's locations may not exactly be complex, but they are cluttered, and many times it's possible to have two players all in the same local area, but crisscrossing behind overturned cars, flipped over cargo containers, half-sunken boats, and destroyed airplanes. Hearing and understanding where enemies are is vital, and it does work here. Weapon sounds are good. The game doesn't go out of its way to layer anything above or below, so it's not really gun-centric in its sound layering. You can go in there and you can adjust whatever you need to. When it comes to the enemies, that's excellent though. Otherworldly, maybe eerie? Absolutely. Hearing a variant's movement in the fog is terrifying if you're low on health, and sometimes even if you're not, especially, like I said before, if it is a hag. One thing I do wish is that the characters talked more. Now, I get it. They have some side chatter. Be aware that the side characters, the main characters, are fine mostly. They're just nondescript. While they do that chatter and one-liners throughout the game, sometimes telling you that they plan to heal you, one place isn't a good place to be, or some other kind of thing, or what their past job was. When you are having so many different types of enemies that require some pretty different ways of taking them on, the chatter would have really helped to have them call those characters out with what kind you might be facing. The gamer does have a text descriptor that you can turn on, which you'll probably see here in some of the footage, but vocally it would have helped a great deal to have more call outs from the actual characters on your team. If you have 4 players, it's probably not going to be much of an issue, simply knowing and identifying what you see regardless. But sometimes you'll have a mix or maybe somebody who's new. It would have been nice to see those characters just do it regardless. Speaking of regardless, that's sort of how I feel the music is in this game. It skews pretty generic for my taste. It gets up and frantic during the encounters. Its ability to change and adapt to events is really truncated though, to the point to where there's not a lot of fade in some circumstances, and sometimes it's just relaxed, then oh my god, it's not relaxed, and then back to relaxed again, all in a very short subsection of time. But I do understand if a lot of people may just turn this off, especially the way the game plays. It doesn't add a ton currently to the atmosphere. It's not necessarily bad, it's just there. And we are there for gameplay. Back 4 Blood sets you in a world where the Ridden, which is a zombie variant, have taken over. You and a growing cavalcade of characters that goes by the nomenclature of cleaners goes out to perform missions on the main world to aid a small human resistance in trying to establish some sort of beachhead for humanity. The game is solely based on builds. Character, weapon, cards. Be aware of that. Starting out with the characters. Each character has a skill. Sometimes it's an adjustment just for them. Sometimes it's team-based. It's best to experiment here as the game's card system can filter this change into something a bit less important later on, depending not only on your own choices, but other people that you have in your group. Each player starts out with a beginner deck made of reflex, discipline, brawn, and fortune cards, and they pretty much do exactly what you think. Be warned, the decks are not connected between Campaign Solo and Swarm, so if you get something in one of them, it will not unlock for the other. You put them into your deck in the order that you want them drawn in groups. That's very important, as say a group of 5 cards will draw those first 5, and depending on the act, the level, the weapon you have, as well as the people you're with, you may want a slightly different rotation depending on exactly what act you're going into, as well as what corruption cards are pulled. At the starting of each level, those corruption cards do get pulled, and you get to see how the game is going to adjust the world, like fog, I said before, or armored variants. More of one kind of a variant, or explosive enemies that if their goo gets on you, it somehow signals the horde. Big changers there. So your job is to basically look at those, put together a deck that not only works for you, but also your team, and also raises your overall chance of winning that level. So to give you some examples of a build, you might decide to go with some kind of sniper rifle build. You might throw combat training in there for more bullet damage, half again as much bullet penetration. You might pick down in front so you don't have to do friendly damage if you're crouched and you get more health. And maybe hunker down, which is another 40% accuracy and some damage resistance. And knowledge is power, which gives you a 10% weak spot bonus, and then round it out with various buffs that you choose. That's completely, utterly useless, though, if the corruption card for fog is drawn, because can't see shit, which means you have to make sure you have a deck built for a couple contingencies. You might also have a shotgun carrying speedster outfitted with huge bonuses to ammo carrying ability, your reload speed, boost to speed if you get hit by an enemy as you get in close, and a timed reload card that hugely increases your magazine or clip size if the time for your reload is just right as you hit low ammo. But if you get a corruption card that causes some enemies to explode when they die suddenly, that doesn't seem so wise either. Now, we have seen a lot of these systems come together like this, but the number of cards mixed with the corruption system does actually engage you in identifying and deciding exactly what you want to do, and it becomes quite enjoyable later on. This is also combined with the weapons, of which you have your normal, your primary, secondary, and your sidearm. They come with various ratings you can expect, common, uncommon, all the way to epic, and the higher weapons not only do more damage and have some abilities, but they also have more slots for customization than your low-level brethrens would have. You have handguns, SMGs, you got your assault rifle, sniper, up close, and others, all rated on typical stats like damage, accuracy, handling, and so on. Adjusting those stats is done by attaching furniture or attachments to these weapons, and they can change the way a gun feels at its basic level, from familiar to uninspired, or from familiar to absolute expert. You can usually identify why you would want an M4 over an AK-47 if you're a certain type of player. But as you add attachments, you do see the possibility of switching out something you didn't expect. And at the starting of each level, the store opens up, which allows for you to not only get bandages and other items, but as well as always 2 attachments and 2 different weapons, which can allow for you to switch those out, and sometimes they are a higher level than what you actually have. Once you guys have all decided and spent the money that you have, you jump out of that safe room. You have the ability to sprint, which eats away stamina, as well as swinging your weapons, which also eats that away as well. You can climb on most anything with a flat surface, but the game does have a number of bugs with movement you should be aware of. For instance, you can fall off things and hang there waiting. Bots will help you, and people will help you up at times. But I found myself looking at a spot and realizing, why is this one segment dangerous? It's like 2 feet deep. Also, explosions will throw you back, but due to how the collision system in the game's environments work, it actually will slide you along something versus you impacting that item. Meaning, if an explosion goes off, it's basically got a higher chance of having you slide towards the one point in a nearby part of the level that will kill you if you wall into it. It doesn't happen a small number of times either. I really have no complaints with how the game feels when it comes to control, but that part in particular really needs fixed. As you go through the levels, the game gives you various easy missions. You go to a safe room, you save some people that have been kidnapped, you attach some helicopters to cables otherwise. At all times, you have a dynamic mission system. The game can alter enemy spawns at any time. Sometimes that ebb and flow is just right, and sometimes it is just another word for messy. It all depends on how the game has its desire to spawn variants or special enemies, which can get hilariously over the top, from fighting 3 tall boys mixed with an ogre and a wretch and just having pretty much your standard weapons, or sometimes facing off against barely anybody and having a minigun. It gets a little bit weird. It's downright insane sometimes, and while the game does have their director system, which is somewhat always looking over your shoulder, I would like for that to have a little bit more finesse, especially when it comes to spawning these special characters, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, you can return to your main base in any level, though of course you will lose the progress, but you will want to do that because when you shuttle back to it, that's when you can actually build more card decks, make new ones, and outfit or customize your characters. You can't do that where you're going through the campaign actual story events. This offers a strangely refreshing difficulty difference too, because if you do that and you return to the game, you'll be drawing new cards for that level, and so you have to be sort of prepared that things can switch. When you play in the online modes, you'll actually get supply points, and those supply points can then be used to unlock supply lines, as you can see here, like Paul's Alley. What I like about this system is when you jump in, you see the cards, you see what they cost, you see what order they need to be bought in, but you can switch between the 3. Whenever you complete one by buying all 8, that goes away and a new supply line is introduced. This is one of the major ways to get cards. Also, in the main base, you can outfit your character with a couple customizations, as well as guns. And be aware, solo unlocks nothing. Nada. It still requires you to be online, also, which sucks donkey balls. It gives you all the cards up front, but that removes this profound desire to, well, sort of play and get any unlocks. The devs have heard this huge uproar on this and have already stated they are looking at it. It is not a situation where you can just play this off and say, oh, well, it's in there, it's no big deal, just play something else. This is one of those problems where they really spent some time on solo and it did not work out, especially with all of the restrictions around it. So I'll be very excited to see them improve that. I was also impressed with the way everything felt. For the most part, the guns feel like they should. This is the first game to make me ever want an Uzi. Nobody wants an Uzi. Let's be honest, that thing is probably more dangerous to anybody on your level than enemies usually. But upon being hag-eaten in a level, I was able to jump into an open slot, and thank God I did. That character had an Uzi, and with the proper upgrades, that thing is damn fun to play with. When you decide to play, you can choose to play either the campaign, there's a swarm mode as well, which is a PvP mode, best of 3, where 4 players play ridden, 4 players play cleaners, and the ones with the most kills win. I wasn't actually a huge fan of that multiplaying. I know some people have liked it, but it just wasn't for me. Matchmaking is a friends list as well as randoms. You do have private lobbies, but be aware that this game runs its servers centrally, even if it's a private setup. Also, there's pretty much no story even with the cutscenes. So if you were hoping to hear some story about how some softball coach was a putz prior to the ridden eating all his grade school kids and shitting them out as a kid pancake on the pitch, you're not really going to hear much of that. The game's on Game Pass, so for Xbox PC players, they can try it out there for sure. For others buying it, there are a couple huge pluses and some negatives here. First, the game's levels may not be complex, but some of the later acts are long, especially depending on corruption cards. That is offset with a number of the later acts in the story using the same locations a couple times. The card system does engage you far more than I expected. And it's so good to be wrong here. We see it a lot of times where you'll get a preview and it's only been done on a couple hours and it's never really representative of a game. Or if you just play a little bit of it and try to review it, sitting down and playing this for many hours really did change my opinion of the card system. But that card system doesn't really say, hey, new people, leap on in here, you may enjoy it, because you may get a bad corruption card on your first game playthrough and you may end up getting a really evil director that spawns a bunch of specials, and it can be highly frustrating. Also, the game suffers from quitters, all kinds of trolls and griefers already, which for me signals one more reason that these guys need to look at not only a solo mode, this has to happen, but a huge number of internal protections that easy cheat, which is what they're using, just doesn't seem ready to handle. But regardless if I was ready to handle it, the fun factor was there in many ways. It's a teamwork game. It's getting together, working through a problem, and knowing sometimes a group may have to sort of carry you because you don't have the exact cards and have to adjust to a corruption card that's drawn. If you want to just do one thing in this game, at some point, sometimes it's probably going to happen that it's just not going to be that fun. Whether it's a higher team damage in enemy spawns or higher difficulties or just an unlucky break, you have to be flexible here. That being said, for a game like this, the unlocks for customizations outside of the cards is lean as fuck. I am not sure if that's a micro just waiting to happen, but for some reason I was expecting many more guns and unlocks there in additions to the customizables for the characters. There are some, don't get me wrong, some guns have more than others, but I really was expecting a lot more to keep you drawn in, and instead it really does seem like they've hinged more of their resources on the card side. Also, bugs. I did have the game crash 12 times for me on the Xbox and a couple times on the PC. We also did have that issue, as I stated, where something would explode and you'd fly over. We also had the store not show up when you start a level, which means if you jump out of that level, everything sort of gets reset if you want to go back in. That was a shitter. You only had one way to do it. Hell of a time matchmaking if the game crashes. It resets all your multiplayer options back to default, meaning you have to go in and adjust everything back to private lobbies and all that if you want. Be aware, I'm talking about this prior to it going live for everybody on the 12th too. So that's a little bit damning. So as you guys know, I rate games on a buy, wait for sale, rent, or never touch it again rating system. I certainly can't say I didn't have a good time, but I think this one is a solid wait for a sale unless you can get it on Game Pass day one for your PC or Xbox, that kind of thing. It does have enough issues, especially when it comes to it being prior to actual full launch, especially with connectivity and that solo mode. Not that a lot of people are going to play this for solo mode, but you need to know that that's actually there. They spent a ton of resources on it, and yet it's pretty borked. There's a lot of little things that pop up here. I do like the fact that as you're playing, if somebody leaves, a bottle jump in, that kind of stuff, you can definitely put together teams in different ways. There is that PvP, but there's enough issues here that I think that it is well worth sort of sticking back and just seeing how it's all going to come together. If you do end up getting it, I am absolutely not saying you will not have a good time, but you do definitely need to be aware of those caveats here. And some of those spawn issues when it comes to, let's say, the special creatures, I'm most likely assuming will end up getting turned down, especially in their first patch.